I bought my first angle grinder for $11 at a flea market in a Walmart parking lot from a guy selling tools out of the back of a Ford Ranger. No box, no manual. The disc that came with it was already warped, like it had been left on a car dashboard in July. I used it for 2 years before a neighbor watching me cut rebar said quietly, "You know that thing could kill you, right?" I laughed. Then I looked it up. That's when angle grinder safety stopped being an abstract concept for me and started being something I actually understood. That $11 grinder is where this whole question starts, because the internet will tell you, confidently, that cheap tools are dangerous and expensive tools are safe, like it's a law of physics. Price goes up, risk goes down. Simple. Except when you actually look at what causes angle grinder injuries, the story gets a lot less simple and a lot more interesting. Start with the numbers, because they're not what most people expect. The Royal Society for the Prevention of Accidents tracked angle grinder injuries in the UK between 2000 and 2002 and found roughly 5,400 a year, making the angle grinder the third most dangerous handheld tool in the country. In the US, the Consumer Product Safety Commission puts the number at around 25,000 injuries annually. OSHA's data on kickback injuries says 1 in 5 of them is fatal, not 1 in 500, 1 in 5. And before you picture any of that happening in slow motion, most people who end up in those statistics weren't wearing a face shield, weren't wearing safety glasses. We're just standing there the way I stood there, holding something spinning at 12,000 RPM with nothing between their face and whatever came off it. Here's the part that matters for the cheap versus expensive question. Almost none of those injuries are caused by the motor. They're caused by the disc. A $200 Milwaukee grinder and a $15 Harbor Freight grinder both spin a disc somewhere between 6,000 and 15,000 revolutions per minute. And if that disc shatters, the motor underneath it is irrelevant. A facial trauma case study described a 26-year-old man whose abrasive wheel shattered mid-cut and drove fragments into his upper lip, his nose, and his cheek. The report never even mentions the grinder's brand. It didn't matter. The disc did. And it's not just abrasive discs. OSHA data on diamond blades puts the fatality rate at roughly 60% when a segment detaches mid-cut. 60%. A diamond blade spinning at speed and losing a bonded segment isn't throwing dust at you. It's throwing a chunk of tungsten carbide composite at ballistic velocity. That's a completely different injury mechanism from an abrasive disc shattering, and it barely gets mentioned in the cheap versus expensive conversation because the conversation usually stops at which grinder to buy, not which disc to put on it. So what actually separates a safe setup from a dangerous one isn't the tool's price tag. It's a piece of paper you'll never read unless you go looking for it. Every legitimate abrasive disc sold in Europe carries an EN 12413 marking, and every one sold to spec in North America carries ANSI B7.1. That marking has to include the maximum rated speed in both meters per second and RPM, and here's the rule that actually keeps you alive. That number has to be equal to or higher than your grinder's spindle speed. If your grinder spins at 12,000 revolutions per minute and the disc on it is only rated for 10,200, the linear speed at the edge of that disc exceeds what it was built to survive, and it can come apart in your hands. That's not a cheap tool problem. That's a mismatched disc problem, and you can create it with a top-shelf Bosch just as easily as with a bargain bin no name. Which is where the counterfeits come in, and this is the part nobody puts in the thumbnail. A buyer's guide from an industrial supplier lists the warning signs of a fake disc. No speed rating stamped anywhere, no expiration date, vague packaging, and a price that's suspiciously below the market average. Bakelite bonded discs degrade over 3 years even sitting in a drawer, and an expired one loses the structural strength that keeps it from flying apart mid-cut. None of that shows up when you're comparing an $11 grinder to a $200 one. It shows up when you're standing in front of a wall of discs at a hardware store, and the 20-pack for $4 has no markings on it at all. Flap discs, cutting discs, grinding wheels. The format doesn't matter. If there's no EN or ANSI stamp, you're buying blind. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you the price of the grinder itself is completely irrelevant, because it isn't. Project Farm ran a head-to-head dyno test across 8 corded grinders, from a $40 Ryobi to a top-tier Hilti, and the differences that showed up were real ones. Sustained torque under load. How much the RPM sagged when you leaned into a cut. Whether the bearings held up after repeated stress. Makita came out of that test looking strong, consistent speed under load, solid build, and DeWalt held its own in the sustained torque category. A cheaper motor bogging down mid-cut can make you push harder, which is exactly the kind of behavior that causes a kickback. So, the tool's build quality does shape your risk. It just doesn't shape it the way the price tag alone suggests, and it's nowhere near as decisive as the $5 disc spinning on the end of it. There's a historical footnote here that I find genuinely interesting. The high-speed angle grinder as a category was invented in 1954 by a German company called Ackermann plus Schmidt, which later became the brand Flex. That's actually where the European slang term for angle grinders comes from. In a lot of countries, people just call them a flex, the way Americans call vacuum cleaners hoovers. 70 years of institutional knowledge went into the safety standards that followed, which makes it stranger, not less strange, that people still buy discs with no markings on them. Here's the thing I keep coming back to about my own grinder, the $11 one from the truck bed. It wasn't dangerous because it was cheap. It was dangerous because nothing about it was verified. No marking on the disc. No manual telling me the RPM ceiling. No idea, honestly, whether the guard was even rated for what I was doing with it. No face shield. No eye protection of any kind. I got lucky for 2 years running equipment I couldn't have told you a single safety spec for. That's not a story about budget tools. That's a story about buying blind. So if you're standing in a hardware store trying to figure out whether you can trust the cheap option, the question isn't really cheap or expensive. It's whether the disc in your hand has a full EN or ANSI marking, a speed rating that matches or exceeds your grinder's spindle speed, and an expiration date that hasn't passed. And whether you're wearing a face shield, because all that disc knowledge means nothing if your eyes aren't behind something rated for high-velocity fragments. A $40 grinder running a certified, correctly rated disc is safer than a $400 grinder running an expired, unmarked one pulled from a mixed bag at a flea market. The price was never really the variable. The paperwork was. I still have that $11 grinder, actually. It sits on a shelf in my garage now, retired, next to a set of discs I finally learned how to read. I don't use it anymore. Not because it stopped working, because I finally know what I was holding.